Ballantines' Classic Library of Science Fiction is a series of collections originally published in the 1970s and 1980s. It gathered together some of the best short works by a selection of authors from the first 50 years of science fiction. While it's referred to as Ballantines from Ballantine Books, you'll notice that the later printings all had Del Rey in the top left corner as well. Del Rey books were edited by Judy Del Rey, wife of science fiction author Lester Del Rey. All this to say that at the time that Judy Del Rey was working at getting this classic library of science fiction together, Lester Del Rey was researching and writing The World of Science Fiction, 1926 to 1976, The History of a Subculture. It was published in 1979. Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel, and today we're going to take a look at science fiction from the years 1926 to 1976, thanks to Lester Del Rey. Why 1926? Well, that's when Amazing Stories was launched, the first magazine dedicated solely to science fiction, or as its editor Hugo Gernsback at the time called it, scientifiction. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and so science fiction became the norm. Looking at the contents of the book itself, we can see that part 1 is the background. There's a definition of what science fiction is. We have the beginnings of science fiction and the rise of the pulps with Hugo Gernsback. Then we move into a division of ages that I think is brilliant. Part 2, The Age of Wonder, is from 1926 to 1937. We see the magazines of Hugo Gernsback, The Dawn of Astounding, a very important science fiction magazine. Del Rey gives us a survey of those stories that are published within these years, and we look at The Active Fan and the Shaping of the Future. The next age is the Golden Age from 1938 to 1949. The Golden Age is largely as a result of John W. Campbell's editing of Astounding magazine. His writers dominated the field in that decade. Writers such as A.E. Van Vogt, Isaac Asimov, and Robert Heinlein. The War and the Bomb, of course, figure large within this time period. There's a proliferation of the magazines, and of course, science fiction starts to move into books slowly. Fandom is growing, and we start to see early conventions. The third age is named the Age of Acceptance from 1950 to 1961. I haven't heard of this name for this decade before, but I think it is a very appropriate one. The Quest for Magic looks at the expansion of science fiction into some of the fantastical realms, including psionic powers. Following the war, there's a big boom of magazines and books. By the end of the decade, the magazines are starting to collapse, but the book business is becoming big business. And then the fourth age he discusses is the Age of Rebellion from 1962 to 1973. The Survivors is about the magazines that still exist in the 1960s, but the torch is passing on to book publication. Then we look at Rebellion, the New Wave, and art. Science fiction is starting to be taught in schools and colleges. And then a fifth age. We don't know what it's going to be, starting in 1974. Part 6 looks at parallels and perspectives. These are mini essays dealing with a number of topics. It concludes with Star Wars, which had just come out at the writing of this book. Although Del Rey recognized Star Wars as science fiction, and important science fiction at that in media, he didn't realize how huge a watershed moment this would be. If 1926 to 1976 is the first 50 years of science fiction, then what has happened to science fiction from 1976 to the present? Unfortunately, Lester Del Rey is not with us to write that 50-year history. Hopefully somebody will take a look at what has happened since Star Wars. Perhaps you might want to comment about that below the video. So is this a worthwhile reference book to own? Well, at first it seemed to get stuck in the minutiae of magazines. So many writers and editors with very short clips about their stories. It felt a bit like a yearbook as they went through year by year and the important stories of those years. But it built up to a good understanding of the history of science fiction magazines and how important the short stories were to the development of the later publications. I found it really interesting, especially in the 1950s and on, as book publishing companies came into being. Anthologies, collections, and fix-up novels start to gather these short stories. And writers, many for the first time, were writing full-length novels. The 1950s was very exciting with this transition happening. And not only adult novels, there were juvenile novels as well. This took the business into a crossover that became very lucrative. Lester del Rey lived this history. In fact, he was an editor of some magazines at that point. His experience provides some gravitas to this account. And then we move into the 1960s, a tumultuous decade, not only for the world, but also for science fiction. We continue to see the death of magazines, the shrinking of the market for short stories. Fantasy starts to gain ground, becoming a genre of its own. And then there's the New Wave. From New World magazine, edited by Michael Moorcock in the UK, to Harlan Ellison's anthology of short stories called Dangerous Visions, the New Wave challenged the norm. Now, Lester del Rey does show his own bias in this area. He thought the New Wave was actually detracting from science fiction. It was just experimental stories going further with sex, drugs, and violence. It definitely was a hot topic in the late 60s and early 70s within fandom. In the 1970s, Judy Lynn Del Rey became the editor for science fiction at Ballantines Books. And a few years later, Lester Del Rey started up their fantasy genre. Together, they had a bit of a stranglehold on the publication industry in the mid-70s. The World of Science Fiction is a great survey of the magazines and book publications from 1926 to 1976. While at times it seemed to get bogged down by descriptions of authors, editors, and stories that appeared in very fast staccato fashion, it did start to hang together in a way that gave you the scope, the perspective of what was going on. I will say that it is heavy towards the United States publication industry. You will find some UK content here, but not much else outside of those two countries. I think it's a worthwhile reference book to have, and I think it's easy to read for all who are interested in science fiction history. I give it 8 out of 10. Well worth picking up if you find it. So I'm curious to hear what you might have to say about this book, or perhaps what you think happened from 1976 on to the present. Please comment below. And until next time, keep reading.